Welcome to Road to Cast episode 5. Today I have my second interview with a up-and-coming, interesting social media influencer, public intellectual, and professor at Royal Holloway at the University of London. It is a big honor to be having a good chit-chat, and also comes off the back of a little technical screw-up on my part. This is actually the second time we're trying this interview because in my immense brilliance, I forgot to turn on my own mic audio recording, so a one-sided conversation is not as exciting for the audience. In those last couple of days between our last interview and this one, the world has taken another series of somersaults, which has shattered the Atlantic Alliance into a dust finer than I could have ever imagined, and here we go. So without further ado, please enjoy the conversation, and if you're feeling so kind and generous, feel free to throw us some cash on our PayPal or sign up for our paid membership on Patreon, and this will allow us to do more stuff going forward. Thank you. All right, so let's jump right into it. We had the crazy battle at the Oval Office with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance jumping President Volodymyr Zelensky, and this led to a series of panicked defense meetings across Europe, and basically everyone trying to either realized that the world had already ended, and then other people trying to more or less sane wash what Donald was doing. And then last night, in the middle of our night, Donald Trump announced that they were going to pause all further military aid to Ukraine, and including the stuff that is currently in transit. This is a big deal, obviously, and is effectively the strongest indicator we've had so far that it's not that Putin, or it's not that Donald Trump wants peace. Rather, he wants to have a peace where Russia wins, and that seems quite clear in this scenario. I mean, just in the last hour, we had the European Commission announce that it was having its first 150 billion euro tranche of defense loans, and this is going to come on top of what's proposed to be an 800 billion euros defense plan that just begins on Thursday, and they are already saying this is just the first level of this. Yesterday, we saw discussions in, I believe, Denmark around their sovereign wealth fund, which is about 1.5 trillion euros for using that to be reallocated for defense. And we had a similar conversation in Germany that was even perhaps more out there, was that instead of seating the new Bundestag, they would in the next few days reseat a special session of the old Bundestag, because there's a 2/3 majority to be able to pass some of the things they need to do to pass a 900 billion euro German defense plan, 400 directly to the military, 500 toward infrastructure. Like, these are insane. These are crazy numbers, but it also just shows you like how much change in a couple of days.
They are crazy numbers, and I imagine there's the shareholders of Lockheed Martin and Alice and Boeing are probably jumping for joy right now, right? The military-industrial complex is like a good old-fashioned geopolitical saber rattling to make some, obviously, clearly there's a whole amount of military equipment which the Ukraine is going to need in order to stop in the short term, the pulling of military equipment from America is going to cost Ukrainian lives. There is no doubt. For example, there's surveillance drones and things, and they actually are able to quite accurately assess where the Russian armies are going to be and some of the advancements and things, and that's been a very important part of military strategy. And of course, that those will now go. And in fact, I think some of them are actually redeployed. I saw a news article on Blue Sky and was suggesting that it might well have just been a coincidence, but as during the bust up at the Oval Office, there was some actual some satellite and drone technology that was automatically redeployed from Ukraine to back to America. So yeah, in the short term, it's a dick move by Trump, clearly, because it's going to cost American lives. And as you say, it's the majority of the money that comes to the Americans goes from the Americans to Ukraine. It's equipment, right? It's not necessarily money. And this whole issue of, it's going to cost, we're not getting our money back. It's like, well, it's not actually money. You're just lending them tanks, equipment. And, the last time I checked, you can't really pay someone's social security with a rocket launcher. So, you have to be able to there is no cash saving, essentially, is what I'm getting at. This Trump and his MAGA crew, and I guess the political narrative which they're pushing is that, it's saving us money and we're not getting any kickback. And it's like, well, really money. So what are these things going to do? These tanks and, equipment and everything, it's just going to sit in a warehouse somewhere? It's going to stay on the boats, on the Navy boats? I mean, that just seems incredibly vindictive.
Yeah. I agree. And I think, we've seen a lot of these studies that have said, around upwards of 80% of the money that the U.S. spent for Ukraine just stayed in the US with American companies, because like at the end of the day, the production is being done in the US. It's US workers doing that. It's US companies doing that. It's also US companies moving the stuff over to Ukraine. Like it's so like every step of the way, the US is basically like creating a stimulus of its own economy, but at the end point, the product goes to get blown up. And that's just how military equipment works. I mean, most of the time you're either maintaining it indefinitely, so you never ever have to use it, or you use it and it gets blown up relatively. And that's just that's what you're making. That is the product. I found it bizarre because also you saw the new conspiracy-minded FBI director, Kash Patel, come out saying he was going to do investigations to where all the money went. And I was just sitting there, I'm like, Kash, are you going to try and get money back from U.S. defense contractors? Like, I don't know. Like, what do you think? What do you think really is going on here? And that's the thing. Like, they live in a fantasy world. Like, there is a literal Ukrainian fantasy in their head. Like, they imagine this fantasy right-wing version of this place. All of these things are happening. I mean, you see this with every statement that J.D. Vance is making. It's an ideological position. It's not one based in material reality. And that's the thing that a lot of world leaders are struggling to get behind. I mean, you see this especially with like Keir Starmer. It's like he has not understood the moment that we're in. He still thinks you can get the U.S. back on side, or that there's some combination of letters or a deal that you can get Trump back on side. And it doesn't exist. Like, it just fundamentally does not exist.
I find that bizarre. You're right. I mean, yesterday, in fact, just last night in the Commons, Keir Starmer was saying, I don't think that they're going to put out, like, literally hours later, Trump takes it away. But it does strike me as, with the letter that he produced from the King, inviting him for a state visit, which people have suggested it was a troll move to see if he could actually read, which if it was, then it worked, because it looked like could. But I think that it was, he played his, Trump card, let's say, of this this invite. But as like you say, as a sort of diplomatic practice in terms of like to try and quid pro quo, we give you a state visit and you continue to fund the equipment in the Ukraine, and it's like, well, actually that's not how Trump works. He doesn't sort of view diplomacy and international relations in his head, and I'm assuming in lots of other people's heads in that room, it was a case of, you just think Trump's brilliant. You've invited him to this sort of ye old English state visit where you get all the the razzmatazz and the British kind of, it's like a trip to fucking Disneyland or something. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and so he doesn't see it as a kind of, okay, this is a part of international diplomacy. I've got to play the game. No, and so Starmer was just sort of very, I'm going to fall back on those traditional tropes of international relations, but it just doesn't work with him. It just, and the fact that he's pulled the equipment, pulled out the military equipment, it just proves this. And so what does Keir Starmer do now? He's left holding this, and so the calls for the cancel the state visit are going to get incredibly loud now. Because there's one thing that Britons are united on, is their the abhorrence towards Trump. We all hate him, including a lot of the reform voters, to be honest. I mean, particularly the ones that Farage is trying to court if he wants to, get any sort of majority, or any kind of, like, even in the local elections as opposed to a general election. The Daily Mail and the Sun, I think, came out and backed Starmer with his kind of move towards the European defense of Ukraine. So anyway, trying to assume Trump and his ilk are going to play normally in the international game is just, it's for the birds. It's fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, there was a quote out from J.D. Vance. Of course, this is going to be inflammatory, but it really reemphasizes how broken and anti-diplomacy they are. Like, it's not that they just don't believe in diplomacy. They're, like, actively against it. He stated, and this is referring to British and French peacekeeping troops, that, quote, 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years.
Yeah. No, I saw that was in Fox.
I guess nobody was in Afghanistan. Like, I guess nobody was in Iraq. Like, what? Like, I guess...
Yeah, I've got...
do the whole Balkan stuff. Like, what is going on here? The thing is, like, on one level, like, a lot of the Trumpers will be like, well, he's just doing it. He's being a strong man, blah, blah, blah. But people don't understand, this is not humans interacting with one another. These are states. And these important things, because Vance is the individual, doesn't fucking matter. It's him as representative of America insulting other countries that there have been decades-long relationships built up. This is permanent damage. And it's like the conservatives, like even the ones that are like maybe not fully on board with Trump, but like kind of like this blustery stuff, they fundamentally do not understand how the world works. Like they think you can just be like the biggest man, the biggest, Chad, and that everyone will naturally move in a way. And perhaps this goes into like their conservative framing of politics, that there is like a natural way the world works, and that's it. But that's not how it works. Like we live in a world built around systems that we've designed because other stuff happened that we designed the systems for. This also just like reminded me again, for example, like Keir Starmer's not invited on Thursday to the EU Defense Summit, which is right. He is not in the EU. Why should he be in that particular conversation? At the same time, this showed his meeting, him trying to set up external bodies to try to deal with a problem, is a direct result of Brexit, right? It's a direct result of like, we can go our own way. We don't have to follow the rules. And it's like, yes, but the rules exist there. Like the EU 27 have permanent committees to deal with these conversations every single day in Brussels and Strasbourg. They are discussing this every single day. It's not just like, we'll set up a conference and then we'll do another one next week. This is like the frustration that I get when people don't understand that we have built a very complicated world, but also a world that there is a reason that these things exist in the first place. Like you can, it's like ideas, like for example, I don't like the way the World Bank functioned or like the WHO, but there would need to be a body that does a similar-ish thing, but in a different way, because we have realized that having some sort of global financial thing is important. And also the same way, it's like we saw regulating trade on a global level, probably important. Like we would have to invent the alternatives. It's not just blow them up because we don't like them.
Yeah.
Like this is the frustration. They think you can blow it up and then the world falls back to, this natural state, this tabula rasa where like everything will work out. And
yeah,
it exists from a politics that exists outside of history. It is from a politics that exists outside of norms, and one that only exists in the weaponized unreality that they need to use on a daily basis to stay in power and feed this reality tunnel they've built for their followers.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that there's a real sense that Trump sees himself as America. This is the classic, like you say, the inflation of the state with the individual. It's like, which is why the deference that Zelensky showed to the machinery of American government in his address to the State of the Union or to address the Congress, whenever it was, he was invited and he thanked the American people, he thanked the American presidents, he thanked the American, and even in the tweet afterwards, after this whole debacle in the Oval Office, he tweeted out, I am thankful to, and he tagged POTUS. He didn't tag Donald Trump. He didn't say Trump. He tagged the handle for the President of the United States. And so Zelensky was very clear that he was operating on the level of international diplomacy and representative of the state and the people of Ukraine, and saying, we are thankful to America, the people of America, the machinery of America, not to you as an individual. And of course, the whole MAGA cult is built upon, coalescing the American ideal around Trump, wrapping it around him completely. And so, yeah, the fact that he sees, I mean, not just him, obviously, I guess it's other sort of fascist regimes around, well, Modi and India are perhaps doing something very similar. And so that with the religious fundamentalism over there, they kind of wrap it up in this mythical notion of, like you say, sort of mythical past, and they're sort of dueling on the world stage. And it's, this might sound a little bit as an aside and perhaps from left field, but it makes sense to me. It's, someone on Blue Sky mentioned that AI is the aesthetics of fascism. And I don't know whether it's just because I dwell too long on these videos because I'm just sitting there open-jawed. And so the algorithm's like, he must like these videos, let's show you more. The ones that of those massive AI images of countries as people. And it's got these kind of big eagles and walking around, and they're all kind of ubermensch, muscular men. And it's like, this is exactly what fascism is. It's the conflation, or at least one part of it, at least. So it's international relations. Conflation of the nation state onto an individual, and subsequently your other point about the kind of building of these extra national institutions is absolutely right. I think it falls back on the Brexit argument. I mean, a lot of the kind of when we were having those debates in the United Kingdom, I remember back in 2016, or the Lexit arguments. See, people like Jeremy Corbyn was accused of being a Brexiteer because he was very critical of the EU. And one of my frustrations is that perhaps Jeremy Corbyn didn't push this hard enough. It's like, well, actually, I don't like the EU. It's incredibly neoliberal. Look what they did to the PIGS countries, and Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain after the financial crash. It was terrible. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have some sort of structure which allows us to communicate and trade and share ideology, share solidarity and everything else across the continent. We do need that. It doesn't, the version of that we want doesn't really look like the EU, but you don't change that system by being outside of it. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't just, the response to the harsh problems of the EU is not to blow it up, it's to reform it and reformulate it, try and turn it into some sort of federative socialist federation or something, you know what I mean? So it's,
It just shows like a deep lack of intellectual curiosity for these institutions. And in many ways, I don't know, I'm sure if hypocritical is the right word, but for example, like Jeremy Corbyn, like this is not a general statement about him, but like him as a person running to be the leader of the UK at one point could not have had the thoughts about the EU like it's irreparably impossible to fix. And also look at like the endless Tory rule of the last century and be like, I can fix her. I can fix it. Like it's a bit of a ridiculous position because you're like, okay, dude, if like you think you can do it here, like you can obviously do it in the place that's already like starting at a bit of a more progressive slant already than, you know, the Tories under Boris. And I also think like something like the European Union, or even just like broadening out to democracies in general, they're iterative. Like they're constantly iterating on themselves. They are in a state of constant motion. Their functions are constantly growing or adapting or morphing around. And you can see this very clearly through the last like 200 years of history. Like a country 2 centuries ago, you would struggle to comprehend, like, how do they not have ministries like that are like how I understand them, or like these structures and all this stuff. These were built up. It took time. People messed up. We built other things. Other countries came up with ideas. We took those ideas. You know, like this is how governance developed. This is how states develop. And democracies, because of their nature as a constantly changing reflection of the populace, they will always be moved in one direction because time continues. And that's something I think people forget constantly. Like, we're going to watch the EU develop an entire like defense wing that out of nowhere just going to start existing in the next few weeks. Like, that's how evolutionary these systems are. And also why, you know, it's very dangerous when you take this US American approach, like the Republicans, right? Like they view the Constitution as sent by God and the founders were like holy men, and that all of this is sacred, and that if you're damaging or moving something, you're doing something unsacred. At the same time, they're literally dismantling the system to create their own version of it. So it's like it's creating this taboo, or what's this academic word that I'm reaching for right now? That it would be like profane to develop your democracy. And you could even see this in like these lower level arguments over like large and big government, like these spatial conceptions of what a thing is instead of actually talking about what it is. Like it's so bizarre at some points, I'll be honest. It boggles my mind.
Yeah, I mean, America's interesting in that respect because clearly, you know, as a country, it's only 200 years old, and it did, or wherever it is, 250. And I imagine what it would be like as sort of, I mean, British people to a certain extent, but someone like Chinese people who have had a Chinese dynasty millennia, and they look at this sort of old and a new country that's kind of fireworks on pop like this, and it's about to crumble into something else. I just as intellectually, I just sort of wonder. It's like, well, I wonder what the kind of cultural imagination is of a country like that. When you've got a country like China, which is so huge and so massive, it's been around for thousands of years, and pretty much in a very similar in so far that geographically, and I guess kind of as a cultural imagination, to witness something like America crop up and then seemingly fall down in however many years it's going to be.
That thought makes me also think about how maybe this is why it's so difficult for Americans to conceive of other options for their future. Like, it's almost always dystopia. In the China example, there were lots of states in China. They all more or less considered themselves the Chinese state at one point or another. And that went on for a very long time. Whereas like you have one American state and there's no before it or after, or the colonial period, but like that's also just in the same lineage of it. Maybe then that is why it's so difficult for them to imagine like profoundly different futures. Like you must have talked to like French people. It's like there's a big yearning for like a fifth republic. They don't view it as the end of society. This one's got some problems. Maybe we should fix them.
So you're right, and I guess it's that's we're talking like good Marxist scholars about the dialectical nature of history, and it just strikes me that the Americans have always in that 250 odd years. I mean, it was an empire founded on the intercontinental genocide of an indigenous people, so it was never really good. It was really on shaky foundations to begin with. Let's be honest, but it does appear to have this very unique political and cultural kind of approach. I mean, again, I saw someone say that Americans were against the idea of big government, but actually, or against it in theory, but actually very for it in practice, insofar as that the social security and the daily running of the country, which requires a state, which requires collective decision, democratic process, in order for people just to actually live. And otherwise you just have this sort of Thomas Hobbesian world. And so, but they perhaps don't really realize that. And they're constantly told through their religion, through their education, that actually the two are very separate. And all that stuff that goes on that keeps you alive actually isn't anything to do with a collective, anything to do with democratic endeavors. It's just to do with either yourself or God, and there is nothing in between. And so this is, clearly the sort of Christo-fascist discourse which has arisen and now has formed a government or an administration. And we're seeing this now play out into the other areas which affect everyone else, including international relations. And I guess trade now with the tariffs that have been put on this morning to Mexico and China's retaliation. So that sort of American exceptionalism, which is characterized by this dualistic Christo-fascist God versus the individual, that is now kind of like a cancer infecting the rest of the world through the empire which American built up, through its cultural empire. I was chatting to a friend of mine the other day at work, and we were like, so, well, how, what would a boycott of American, if Europe, which, is not a million miles away, if we have to go down the route of what we did to South Africa in the 80s, the boycotts and everything else, it's like, what would that look like? We'd all have to, we all like Google and Netflix, and there's so much of our culture is bound up into Americanism. It's like, how would we manage at all to extricate ourselves from that? And it'd be so difficult. It's almost a bit of a non-starter. But anyway, I don't know. It's exponential.
I've been thinking the exact, like, particularly this boycott thing. I mean, you've probably seen, like, I'm putting it almost in every single one of my videos. I think it'll be moving mountains. I think it'll cost the same amount as this, like, military buildup. Like, we're talking, like that, like, for example, like, a lot of the consumer stuff is easy, especially in Europe. Like, we got a lot of countries, a lot of agriculture produce, like, our consumer goods, we can move around. The technology is where it becomes a major problem, and the digital services. And like, even if you as an individual want to cut yourself off of all the subscription services, the bigger problem that people are not immediately thinking about is enterprise class computer systems for government and businesses. And those are exclusively Mac or Microsoft systems, and mostly.
Yeah.
And so, like, yes, there's we have Linux that's in the EU, but it also would need to be scaled up and then replaced on every single computer on the continent. Like, this would be like a Y2K level of, like, digital shift, but even bigger. It would be a bigger thing because they didn't even have to bootstrap enterprise OS in a few months.
It's the same because, I mean, I boycott Amazon. I don't have a Prime membership. I do I try and get rid of them as much as I can. But then someone says, oh, well, but AWS could use their web services. It's like, well, yeah, I know, but it's just, there are certain ways, can't really get around that, really. It's that, I have to live and I have to sort of engage with these systems. And actually, so there's so much of its flaws into our system, which, it's kind of.
And I think the statement to, like, tell someone after that, it's like, yes, this emphasizes the problem. Like, our government's been at this point. It's bad. It's a bad thing. But also, in many ways, I think this can also lead to a bit of a cultural renaissance, especially like in the European Union side. It will give people a lot of excuses to make their big budget proposals, for film subsidies or music or art or whatever. Like, one of the things that people forget is the U.S. heavily also subsidizes the cultural industry, both at the state and the federal level. And it's like, there's also a reason why so much get pumped out. It's because it's a subsidized industry. The same thing can happen around the world. We can build up more international culture. We can build up even, like, streaming services that are not so U.S. centric and not based in the U.S. and be able to give more creators and voices and yada, yada. And I think that is a huge opportunity if we want to have a different world going forward that isn't just in a constant, like, state of dealing in reaction to every American thing, both cultural and political. So often I think one of my critiques of left-wing discourse, not like you and I and the people we all hang around, but the longer track of, like, the bread tubers, is because the financial incentive was to cover kind of like American style and American framings of politics. Even the European creators would end up getting stuck into just doing tons of stuff around America. And this is not good, because if most of the big big names in your political ideology are just focused on one country's politics, and that country has pretty unapplicable politics for everywhere else, it's a bit of a problem. And it also shows like why we kind of stall out in many respects. It's like, people have critique of left-wing media. How much of that is spent on the US over the last 10 years? Like a ton of it, like most of it. And so like, these are things I think about. It's like detachment is scary. It'll be painful. It will do these things. It also allows us to create that post-US empire world, which we will need to do. It's not a choice. Like we don't have like these are choiceless choices. They will come to us. We can choose whether or not to do something about them.
Yeah. You're right, and there's plenty of models out there to look at. I mean, Latin America has put some interesting ways. I mean, the New Mexican president has put some interesting and quite useful policies, particularly around sort of citizens' assemblies and democracies. You've got participatory budgeting, and which goes on in Brazil quite a bit. And even in sort of Pan-African solidarity, the Burkina Faso guy, who's they created kind of Pan-African kind of socialism. And so I think that there's this sort of obsession with the, US as the harbinger of democracy and, as a bastion of the free world and stuff is, clearly propaganda. And it's clearly a propaganda which a lot of the Western governments have swallowed for the last, 150 odd years. And so it's, to see it come crumbling down, it's going to be messy and it's going to be, deadly, I suspect, for large swathes of the population. And of course, you throw climate catastrophe into the mix, and all of a sudden you've got a real, catalyst for change, because it needs to happen now. So yeah, I think it's a really important sort of seismic shift, and to think that it kind of came about because someone asked Zelensky whether he wore a suit or not. It kind of feels very, a particular moment. It does feel very eventful in the kind of philosophical sense. The kind of a rupture in the world, and the reverberations of which will be felt. I mean, obviously they'll be felt now, but I mean, in years to come, the kinds of the outcomes of that meeting, sort of new, the split of the transatlantic trade alliance and a kind of bolstering of European identity as a, with the army and everything, for better or for worse. So yeah, so it does feel, like a bit of a rupture. I don't know, maybe I'm being too forthright. I mean, I always fall back on the work of Alain Badiou, who's a sort of radical Maoist philosopher, really, and French guy, and he talks about events and ruptures and how they fundamentally changed the world. And he always falls back on particular examples like the French Revolution, the Cultural Revolution in China. From a politics point of view, he has sort of, things like science, when the apple fell on Galileo's head, for example. There are examples of key moments of events which completely changed the entire fabric of that world. Interesting things like 9/11 isn't an event because it actually stored up geopolitical hegemony. And so there are sort of examples of massive global events which actually aren't quote unquote events because they don't actually change anything. They just ossify existing power relations. And so ever since Badiou's work has always been quite enlightening to me. I'm always looking for when's the next event? And obviously we can't tell because it takes, decades, centuries for it to kind of become known as retroactively known as an event which actually, changed the entire political structures and actually spilt newness into the world, spilt actually something incredibly new. So whether at some point something would have happened in the last 5-6 years, perhaps, which we might look back on in years to come and centuries to come and go, do you know what? That was a real rupturing event. So Alain Badiou's work is quite important in that respect.
Yeah, no, I think a lot about this other term, potentials, like fascist potentials and potentials for the future.
Mm.
I think of it whether or not events open up new ones or close them off, or how that affects it. And so for the last couple of weeks, since basically the Munich Security Conference, I've been in my mind just imagining like more and more potentials that could have been other paths that other than the one we're rolling down are being wiped out. And that's, I think, for me, the most worrying thing is that like the other options to get other outcomes are getting severely limited. And this for me is something that I find very worrying. And in the same way, I agree with you totally. For a few years back, I was saying like, when we look at the rise of fascism or even the beginning of the Second World War, much earlier in the time frame than 1939. And so like you might be living through it. You might be in the pre-fascist time. You might be in the pre-Civil War era. You are not aware of it yet. You might feel it like I'm feeling it, but until it's already happening, then you're only guessing at what timeline you're in, what path you're walking down. But at the same time, like I think it's really important to remember that these things are not fated. I'm deeply Marxist on this belief that like the future is built one step at a time, and every step chooses what direction it's going. And you have to move it into that direction. It doesn't happen, or else it'll be moved for you because you're not the only one trying to push it. And I think it's very important to understand, like, yes, world events are overtaking us and things are moving and breaking and blah, blah, blah. But that does not make us hopeless. It does not make us helpless. It just means one particular side is pushing really fucking hard right now. And we can do an equal and opposite. Like, we are not without our own capacity and agency, both on like individuals organizing collectively, but also on like state levels or international organizations. Like these groups have heft. And I think it's always important to remember, like, yes, the US is powerful. Yes, China's powerful. Yes, Russia's powerful. They are not all powerful. They are not gods. None of them are can do what they want anywhere. I mean, Putin could even invade Ukraine like he wanted to with the largest, second largest military at the time or third largest military at the time. So there are opportunities for the future, and also there will always be an after. I think that's something that I have to always kind of keep in my head. It's like, even in the worst parts of World War II, even in the worst parts of World War I, there was an after, and that after was things were able to be done. It's not ideal, but the world that came out of the Second World War was significantly more, just in Europe at least, than the one that went into the First World War. And like, these things can still come out with something better. And even in the military buildup, I think it's important to remember, like, it's not just about building tanks, because at the same time the US was, sending Lend-Lease to the US and the Soviet Union, they were building up their entire administrative state basically out of scratch. And like, these things concurrently exist with one another. The New Deal exists concurrently with the military buildup. And that should give us inspiration and also broaden our horizons on what is possible. And I think that's really important. And also that politics does not stop because of the crisis. That's the other thing.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's a really important point, the sort of future and everything else you bring up about that, because we mentioned this before, and the different ways of viewing the future. And yeah, I was, when I'm talking to this about my student fields, obviously discussions will always end up descending into this realm, even if we're talking about cities, or lecture the other day about the creative city discourse, Richard Florida and the whole sort of skateboarding thing. And then even that descended into kind of discussions about Trump and fascism. And it's so the sort of way I always try and boil it down to them is like, well, you have the progressive, let's say the left, or, they want to open the future up. They want to kind of expand it and include everybody and have different futures and different timelines. And then you've got the kind of neoliberal centrists, the Starmers and Macrons of this world, who just want to keep it exactly the same. They want sort of, and I think we said like the apotheosis was like 1997. I just kind of joked, it's sort of neoliberal Venice, when everyone was making loads of money off being a neoliberal, basically. And they just want that present to continue, the kind of capitalist realism of Mark Fisher. And then you've got the fascists who kind of want to completely close it down. And there's a sort of, there's various discourses of this sort of, you could talk about the rapture, the sort of Christio's Zionist movement, which is why a lot of the sort of this stuff in the Middle East is going on, because they're trying to put everything in its place so for the second coming of Christ. You've got the singularity as a sort of final position with the techno-fascists in Silicon Valley. And of course, the Macho man himself talked about final solution. And there is this sort of finality to their view of the future, this kind of this moment which will happen, and you either perish or you survive, depending on how strong you are or how prepared you are. So yeah, it's that the relationships that you have with the future, I think, says a lot about your political outlook. And I think that that sort of dichotomy, not dichotomy, that taxonomy is quite evident, I think, it particularly in today's world with what's going on.
Yeah, I think, and we chatted about this before, it's this completely diametrically opposed conception of time. For a fascist, the end time is moving towards them, and for all the other ideologies, for various reasons, their future is infinite. Like, it will keep going, and when they achieve their utopia is not a set place in the future, and it is dependent on basically their own actions. Whereas the fascists feel it is always, always moving towards them, and the end is near, and the final battle is here, and they have to win it, or else everything falls. And this explains a lot of like why they act how they act, because if you thought the world was going to end, you would act in a really different way. Imagine if a political ideology did that. It also makes me think about this book I read a while ago that I think profoundly changed my life. It's called Hyper Objects by Timothy Morton, a professor out of Texas. And it's mainly about climate change and how the idea of a hyper object is a fifth dimensional object. So think a tesseract like out of marble, but you can't see the whole thing at the same time. It's not like a cube that you can pick up and flip around all the sides because it exists throughout time. You as a human who can only see time in your particular moment can only see a slice of the hyper object. They can only see a slice of it. And even though we could measure other parts of it, like we can measure climate, and climate itself is a hyper object because it exists throughout time. It is a massive thing. It is something that we can't directly observe. We can only measure, its effects, climate, like the temperature rising or water levels or whatever. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway that I got out of this book was we already have lived through the end of the world. It's already happened. So what do we do now? How do we have politics after the end of the world when the disaster has already happened? We are not trying to prevent climate change. We live in a climate changed world. And it is important to think of our politics after that point. Because if you just think of your politics purely as preventing the thing from happening, you're blocking yourself up from creating what could be in the future and actually dealing with the thing as it is. And I think for me, that really radically changed how I approach democracy, anti-fascism, or even just like leftist thought in general. And I realized like there's no end point. There's no game over sign. For us individually, or individual political movements, but the world keeps spinning, time will keep going. Things might get harder, but that doesn't mean we get to give up or politics ends. And it doesn't make the struggle more or less worthwhile. It's always worth it because you're trying to build a more just world, at least in my conception of left-wing politics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. There's a similar book, After the Apocalypse, Srečko Horvat, who's like a Croatian philosopher who had a similar kind of take insofar as that, there are certain materialities of the world which are apocalyptic, and so you have to kind of deal with that from a cultural sense. And so this sort of the idealism that stems from the material worlds has to kind of match. And so if it's apocalyptic materialism, you have to kind of have a political ideology that is post-apocalyptic as well, which is sobering, but like you say, it is an element of kind of hopefulness in it, because it's like, well, yeah, these things will pass and they will finish, and then we have to build the world out of the rubble. It's just that for the fascists, that they're the ones that sort of seem to be sort of dominating the discourse of what the kinds of worlds they want to build. I mean, yeah, it's interesting to me, but having conversations with students about it, the extremes, this sort of swinging from like extreme hopelessness to extreme despair, is almost the characteristic of that apocalyptic materialism, insofar as that, late capitalism is to blame as well, because we hear about these massive events, these hyper events, like you say, like the burning of the planet. At the same time, we have to fill out spreadsheets on a daily basis in order to pay the rent. And so we have created a system in which the small scale, the kind of everyday scale, has become so yoked to the massive, to the planetary scale, that our brains are sort of feeble, pink, fleshy computers in our head can't quite cope with that existential gap, if you like. And so we do end up sort of swinging, which is why we have anxiety epidemics and depression epidemics and everything else. But it is because of this massive sort of swing from one to the other. It is problematic, but yeah, it stems from this kind of apocalyptic materialism, like you say. This sort of the world has ended, or is we're living in the end times, and the climate has changed, the politics has changed. So yeah, it's it's depressing in equal measure as well as kind of hopeful, because depending on your kind of depending on which side of the bed you get out in the morning, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting.
It actually reminds me of when you were talking this video game called Tyranny. And basically it takes place after the Dark Lords has already won, and you play one of his functionaries, and you can still make moral choices in this world, like this world that Sauron won, he got the ring back, like all the things happen, but you can still find goodness. You can create goodness even in worlds that are broken. And it's something that we have to always remember, that if you're on the left in general, or even a liberal, like there were significantly worse versions of the world than right now, like on average. And so it's like, yes, things are very, very bad, but things have been bad. They will be bad. And that does not mean you stop or you try to building the thing you are. And I think also it's very important for people to start really reflecting on whether or not their beliefs are fit for the 21st century. Because one of my big kind of bed bugs is that a lot of our ideas that we're, that are kind of constraining us, is because so many of our politicians still think they're living in the end of the 20th century, and they keep doing 20th century solutions to problems that they weren't fit for purpose then. They're not going to be fit for purpose now. And I think it's really important, especially for younger people getting into politics, who tend to model their behaviors over a politician that got them inspired to get into it, to really always be reflecting. It's like, is this my idea? Do I actually think this is good? Or is this an idea I've gotten from somebody else that I am repeating? And this is strong, and you have to constantly be doing this, because we are sponges. We're constantly taking in a ton of stuff. But it's always very important to be like, do I actually believe this nonsense? Like, is this something I really want to put time into? Or like, is this a actual thing that we should be working for in the future? Or can we fix it? How can we change it? You need to always be broadening your imagination on your possibilities, both good and bad, I think, especially the bad part. People seem to limit their imagination on how bad things can get all the time for their own pain.
Yeah. But you're right. I wrote an essay on my blog a while ago, Escaping 1997. It was a bit tongue in cheek, but it did the numbers largely because it was an attempt to sort of position our political conjunctures like we haven't really escaped. I mean, in terms of our political discourse, in terms of the meta narratives that we have. I mean, we flirted with stuff kind of in the post crash era, but like the election of Starmer, and I guess you could talk about Biden back in the 2020 election, but obviously that has changed irrevocably now. But there is a sense that, America is trying to push us out of that in the wrong direction, clearly. But there was this sort of utopian political imaginary of the late 90s, which is people are trying to recreate now. I think Starmer modeled himself on Blair, who modeled himself on, Attlee. And so there's this real sort of sense of repetition. We see it with cultures, remakes and band reunion tours. And, I mean, really from a cultural perspective, 1997 appears to be kind of, Oasis has reformed, right? So it's, although that's, if you believe the rumors, it's purely done because he needs to pay his divorce bill. Noel Gallagher's divorce was up to 120 odd million or something.
Little famous people only do stuff because they have divorce bills, or gambling problems. Like, there's only a couple of reasons.
Yeah.
Like my mom used to tell me, I can't remember who it was, but they were like, I was just like, why is he in this movie? And she's like, he's got a lot of ex-wives.
It's crazy. And obviously there's no money to be made on like selling records or streaming anymore. So if you set yourself up for this lavish lifestyle and have a number of wives, then you've got to keep touring until you're 80 and or whatever it is to pay the bills. So so culturally we kind of, and that, I mean, I think there is a serious point because it kind of does squeeze out the newness. Anything that's new, like genuinely new culturally and creatively, kind of just get completely squeezed out. I mean, it does happen. This stuff is there. And actually the pandemic was good for that, because I think the pandemic emphasized how during a kind of time of slowdown and actually quasi-universal basic income, at a time when people were getting paid but they weren't doing any work, actually there was, there was some interesting new forms come out. I mean, the platforms that we had were relatively new. I guess TikTok was quite new as well. And so there was actually, that was a time, and, arguably that in order to have radically new artistic forms which actually can change the way of the world requires a regression of the kind of labor model and work, essentially, and kind of capitalist grind. But that aside, there is lots of really interesting new stuff going on, but it just kind of gets completely squeezed out because of the desire to maintain the status quo, and B, that's how people need to make a living. And so people are completely risk averse, music producers, Hollywood studios. So, and that had a detrimental effect on our ability to think new things, because clearly building new societies comes from art. There's ideas of newness, of how to reorganize our societies. They are forged in the fires of our artistic mind. This is what Ursula Le Guin talked about all the time. And so if I was a fascist dictator, the first thing I would do was and I had a new tool that imagined like AI, for example, the first thing I would do was use it to construct art and pictures and words and strip any kind of ability of real artists to make a living out of art. And what have we done? That's exactly what OpenAI is done for. Generative AI is kind of the first people to lose their jobs are going to be artists or people. And we're seeing this right now. So I'm very passionate about this. I think this is what the commons and kind of the radical anarchist leftist thought is about, is that there is no distinction between common life and artistic life. In free capitalist societies, art and culture was indistinguishable from daily life. It is something that just happened. It was part of dancing and singing and all that. It was part of life. Whereas what capitalism has done is kind of completely extricated it, driven a wedge between life and art. And it's made art so difficult to do. Even as a kind of even as a sort of successful artist, you still have to kind of play the market, play the game in order to sort of make a living. You can't sort of do experimental stuff anymore. And what AI has done is just completely clobbered that. So it said, well, actually, no one gets to make any money. We're just going to scour the internet. We're going to churn out this utter bullshit fascist aesthetic and therefore just completely kill any lifeline that artists had to make a living. And so then you got to go and work in Starbucks now. You got to go and work in a coffee shop. So the killing of art would be the first thing I would do if I was a fascist dictator. And what have they done? They pretty much killed any kind of semblance of making money from art, at least.
Yeah, I mean, you see that on the AI side, as you said, but also you can see it in the more traditional way. I mean, Trump literally made himself the head of the Kennedy Center instead.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me make this even more ridiculous. He appointed the entire board, who then appointed him. It's a very North Korea thing. But yeah, it's. I also think the other part of this is, the reactionary politics of now premises the idea that if we return to the mythic age in aesthetic and form, or at least a simulacrum of it, then the utopia exists. And I think this is really important for people to wrap their heads around. Like they literally are premising the idea that like, if we revert things to how they were back in the past, and this depends on what kind of fascist you are, could be the 1850s, could also be the 1950s. And those are specific dates for a reason. But it's like, they do believe that if they can reach a certain percentage of authenticity towards that period, utopia occurs. Like it just snaps into place. And this is like the old school, like Hitlerian approach to it. It's like, once we win the final battle, vibes, everyone. And like, it's a fucking insane position, because like, that's not how things work. They don't just work. But that is unfortunately what they do believe. And you can see that in how they're quite rapidly dismantling the federal government. Like they literally believe that the country is being damaged by the government governing vital systems. And they think that there will literally be a utopia after they dismantle the literal government. It's absurd. It's frustrating. It's also intellectually insulting to anyone who knows anything about anything. But that is their belief. They fundamentally
in for awakening. I mean, I guess with the tariffs aside, we saw the Dow Jones tank yesterday, and there was I think there were some warnings about the next quarter is going to be a massive like minus 2.5.
You saw the GDP cliff on the.
Yeah, yes. I think that all this, for all the fascist posturing that Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation have done, like if people's material conditions go down, then the project will fall. And so I think that the proof of the pudding here will be when the American life just degrades and everything's become so expensive, wages fall, and the economic conditions deteriorate to such an extent, that will be the ultimate, because fascists are great until they're not popular, until people's lives are degraded. And so, by then, if he's got enough of a kind of martial law military kind of take, then, he might be able to quell the uprisings. But I don't know. It comes back to, I guess, what Mark was saying. If people's materials conditions worsen, then, you can have all the power in the world. It's not going to work. So that I think will be where the crux comes, whether it's in the summer and it's a bit hotter and people can actually go out on the streets. I think it's going to get very, very messy indeed.
Yeah, I think also we have, we got the government shutdown coming in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
And I mean, like, it looks very clearly that the Republicans don't have enough votes to do it on their own, even though they on paper do. But then also the Democrats have decided to hold the line so far, which is good. That's what they should be doing. But yeah, that'll just hyper accelerate everything. Yeah, I'm of the opinion, like, the U.S. in the current constitutional order does not reach July. That is my firm belief, and unfortunately I feel like every week is making that timeline seem a lot more optimistic.
Yeah, I think something fairly seismic will happen in the summer, but hey, got the World Cup and the Olympics to look forward to in the new Republic Gilead or whatever they call it then. But
Trumptopian,
Trumpland and
red, white and blue land.
Yeah.
It's also like the thing we have to reflect on is it's not just the U.S. going after Ukraine. It's not just the U.S. going after Canada or Mexico or Greenland or Canada. It's all of these U.S. allies. It's the entire system. And everyone except for Vladimir Putin for some reason.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just, he's got the P tapes clearly.
Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't even do it for me. Like at this point, like I feel like any compromise ad, it doesn't justify Trump's activities. I know Trump's weird and like super narcissistic, so it means a lot more to him than the rest of us. But yeah, it's stupid.
And that a lot of copying on each other. If the Trump, if the
Oh, 100%.
yeah,
They'll do it ironically and be like, ha ha ha, aren't we like
I know we're going more diapers and ear things.
you don't piss on each other. But yeah, I think in this moment it's really important to understand like international solidarity is the thing. Hello, dog.
She was whimpering at the door, so I thought she can say hello.
You're so cute.
Yeah. She is. She has her moments, so she's whimpering. She just wanted to cuddle. I think.
You have some final thoughts you want to lay down?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things I was interested in hearing your opinion about, or at least just, we've talked about this sort of open fitting towards kind of that. I did see some stuff about AOC. I mean, I think that she seems to be sort of saying all the right things, and wonder if she is the sort of the bright spark of this. So is it because she didn't do a huge amount last time round? She kind of said all the right things, but ended up being kind of pushed to the wayside. And I get the impression that if there is anything that's going to come out of this, and I know Bernie Sanders has been doing a tour recently about kind of the oligarchy and all this sort of stuff, and he's been getting a lot of Republicans involved. And like I said, with this whole kind of this economic crash on the horizon, are we going to sort of see someone like AOC or kind of rise from the kind of ashes as a socialist, an electable socialist sort of leader who can sort this mess out?
I mean, there's a couple of things here. So I think the two people that have really risen to the top in the Democratic Party are AOC and Jasmine Crockett. They've both been very much out there doing all the stuff. If there are two people I put their money on to be the party leaders, or they're effectively also just the de facto party leaders now because of the competence of the actual people with those roles. My fear is AOC doesn't reach the next presidency, and that is because the Department of Homeland Security Secretary has been repeatedly saying that he wants the Justice Department to investigate her, which I see that ending in her imprisonment at some point. And I'm deeply worried that she will end up being the first major U.S. political prisoner because she is so, part of the right-wing mythology. Like she's one of the arch evils of the U.S. system. So I have a lot of fear for the Congresswoman, and this extends to other people too, but they seem to be hyper obsessed with her in particular. That said, at the same time, I think whatever comes out after this will be a very different Democratic Party. I think the old way of running things, this corporate Democrat thing, is so the American people are just so angry about it and so pissed off, and there's just so much movement to literally, like, people are going on camera saying like primary every Democrat, like just across. Like the level of visceral rage is not going down. People are getting more angry that Democrats aren't standing up. They think the party basically needs to be completely cleaned out and new people put in. And then also, like, they want, like, people are rampantly for a generational shift, and not just, like, I think a couple of decades. I mean, like, younger people. So that I think we will see a much younger party, a much more progressive party, a much more reflective party of the country. And also it's important to remember, like, on a default level, when you ask Americans about a bunch of like lefty quote unquote policies, like they're for them like ridiculously overwhelmingly. They have been like this for ages. Like all that attention around Bernie Sanders wasn't because there's so many like dedicated Marxists. It's because like he sold stuff that people like. And I think that's also always important. And in a hypothetical where we get to an election in 2028, the country will be wanting like New Deal levels of state expansion. Yeah. And there will be a huge amount of the administrative state to rebuild. And that means whoever is that president, whoever is that Democratic Party, will be the most important figure in this century of American history. And it'll be theirs to make or lose. So that will be a very big deal. And I think that's why I'm cautiously, in the smallest part of my heart, like optimistic there is a better future, a second American republic. But I am really worried it doesn't happen. Like, we don't get to that election. We don't get those potentials, so that those are being blocked off. And I cannot see that occurring if Trump continues his detachment from all international politics. Because one of the main reasons you don't cheat at elections as a democracy, even when you're in the authoritarian mindset, is because all the other countries get really pissed off and then they do stuff in response to it. If he's already pissed them off, if they're already doing all their responses, if all the cards have been laid out, there's nothing stopping Donald Trump from staying.
No, it's
the scary part.
And he's even signed an order about the post office. So you have to put the post office into administrative control, which is obviously where all the ballots go, so you can rig the anyway. Yeah. Well, look, I think we have to remain hopeful, and let's let me have this conversation in a few months' time and see where we're at.
Yeah. I mean, I have to always just remind myself that I like maybe even if it's very what's the word I'm looking for? Hubristic. But it's like you have to believe you're not going to lose. Like you have to fundamentally believe that you will win at some point. You're just going to take a lot of hits in the meantime, and you have to always think of it like it's a war, and in a war there's a lot of battles, and you can lose a lot of battles, and you can still win the war. And that's how the right has always viewed it. They've been on their mission for decades and decades and decades, and they took every loss as not a complete destruction of their political movement, but as something to get really angry over and overcome. And that is something that we should take out of it, should understand there's, yes, a current crisis now. There's also things we will need to build in the future. And the success of a modern political movement is by playing both the short and the incredibly long game at the same time.
Indeed. Well, here to that. I just need to, I'm going to see the t-shirt. This is, so I'm not sure if you can see it, but the,
You actually bought the Cybertruck man. That's awesome.
yeah, I bought it. It was, so if people don't know, it's Zez Vaz. I thought I bought it. It's his name is ZEZVAV. Vaz.
I know. I'll link him in the show notes. He's lovely. He makes it great.
I saw it. I thought I love that. And given my penchant for t-shirts and how now our political slogans need to be emblazoned upon our apparel, I thought I'd show that. So yeah, so go and have a look. It's stuff. It's very good.
Yeah, and maybe even that can be our final shout out. Political shirts are cool and very important in political times. They are not
exactly. Yeah,
like they're good.
Anything like that is it.
Yeah, very important. Anyway, thank you for being with me, and I hope you have a lovely day. And